I'm still here.
Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are back for day number 2 of the 2024 World Championships Swiss stage. I am excited to get into this. Day number 1, of course, happened yesterday. That's how days work, as I'm sure you're well aware. If you want to check out that video, it's going to be linked up in the iCard up next to my Worlds playlist, where we've covered every single game at Worlds so far. The plans, we did some pre-Worlds coverage. You can check all of that out in that playlist, but of course, day 1 will be linked separately up there if you are just interested in how the main stage ended up starting. But we're carrying on here in day number 2 because it is Swiss stage, because that is the format. Day number 1 mattered a lot in terms of determining who plays against each other here on day number 2, so I would definitely check that out if you haven't seen it, but I'm assuming because you're here you have. So I don't want to waste you guys' time too much in the beginning. We're going to be going over all 8 games here from day number 2, the 1-0s, the 0-1s. We're going to be talking about how things are moving forward, so let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and of course we will be talking a bit about the bracket and the format at the end when we get our draw for the next stage. We're getting dangerously close to determining which teams are going to be both eliminated from the tournament and making it through to the quarterfinals. By the end of today, we're going to know our teams that are going to be at the very least fighting it out for that, the 4 teams on each side that will be fighting it out for that. So very excited to go over it, but of course up on the screen you can see the bracket. There was a lot that happened yesterday, not really a ton of upsets. There really weren't any gigantic shocking results. Everything went kind of as expected. I think if you were looking for something like surprising, then you were probably a little bit disappointed by day number 1. But will that trend carry over into day number 2? We will have to see. I think there are a lot of fun matchups. We went over them at the end of the video yesterday if you want to know my predictions on who I thought was going to win these games. But again, the only way to know how these things end up going is to go over them in the video. So I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. You want to get right into the action? Let's get right into the action. Our first game of the day was an LPL Civil War clash. Our first matchup between regions, between the same region at the World Championships this year. It was the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming, taking on the number 3 seed from the LPL in Gen.G Esports. And you wanted upsets. Here is an upset. Gen.G picking up the win here in the first game of the day. We've already started off incredibly hot. This was a weird game to talk about. First off, at what point can we start saying all of the Rumble is dead talks? It's just gone. This champion is so strong in mid and late game team fights. He still is able to really blow up any sort of backline that is not prepared for him to be able to separate them. He reminds me so much of how something like Aatrox was played for a long time, and I know obviously they're very different in terms of how you would execute that, but his ability to separate that front and backline to create havoc and chaos to allow things like Yone, Nocturne, Ashe to be able to do a bunch of damage super consistently to the front line, be able to create these odd-numbered fights, and really just force the enemy team to play a lot more careful and a lot more safe. And he continues to perform really well at Worlds. I know I've had a bit of a bone to pick, we'll just say, with the desk and the casters over the course of this World Championship, because I just do not think they've been accurately representing the meta or the teams really at all. I feel like a lot of them probably haven't watched a lot of the regions that they don't immediately cover, including the LCK and the LPL, which does seem a bit frustrating, but this game definitely had some good storylines, and I think the draft continues to play out in the way that I'm expecting, with things like Rumble and Yone continuing to be dominant combos for BLG. what happened today? This was a very weird day. Not only did obviously they start to lose out in the mid to late game, but they had good early games. They were winning 1v1. You had Knight getting a lane kingdom in over Scout. He was up in a bunch of CS. You had Bim dominating the 1v1 on the top side, only to be significantly less relevant as the game went on. But you're also missing bans. Like, you just completely skipped your 5th and final ban. It felt like you were discoordinated in a lot of team fights. On was getting picked out for no reason in the middle of this game, and that's not entirely out of the realm of understanding, but it just felt like BLG was very off their game today. This is not the kind of day to be off your game. This is the World Championships. If this was just an off day, then you gotta hope that you turn it around quick, because you don't really have a lot of time off here. So we'll get to that, but let's start with the good stuff for LNG. Player of the game pretty much has to go to Zika in the top lane here. What an amazing game on the Rumble. I mean, this guy continues to dominate on champions like this. I was really high on him in the regular season and just generally domestically. I thought he was getting undervalued by a lot of analysts. I know that he's pretty highly thought of in the Chinese community itself. Like, it's more of a Western thing that he is looked on as, you know, kind of an average player, but I think he was an all-pro caliber top laner for LNG for a majority of this split. He certainly was better than what he was in spring, and I think he has leveled up. Now, that's not to say that he can't just have a ton of ordinary games sprinkled in there. I think a lot of his games are very average or just kind of okay, but you do see glimpses of a star top laner there every so often, and this was another one of those glimpses. I already talked a bit about how Rumble is so strong, but Zika's very good at operating champions like this in a really high level. He's not the best laner in the world. That's never really been his MO, but the mid games have been really strong. He's kind of in that Bin mold, if you will, where, you know, as good as Bin is in lane, what Bin is known for is being able to take over in separated 3v3s or 5v5s later on in the game. Zika's very much a similar type of player, and so you get him into that environment even though he is losing. Rumble as a champion has so many tools in the late game. He's essentially become, as I've said in previous videos, the new Kennen in this meta, where whatever you get from him in lane is a complete bonus. The rest of the game is just like ultimate. Try to find avenues to be able to burn people down, and you can blow up team fights relatively easily, and that's what Zika was able to do. Really excited to see if he can keep that form up, because again, you know, LNG's been talked about as kind of a one or a two horse race, right? Or two-headed monster, if you will, because of Scout and Gala, and I think to an extent that has been correct over the course of this year, but if you can get top lane really rocking and rolling and like clicking and jiving with the rest of the roster, then that's going to be very dangerous for other teams. LNG was looking like one of the best teams in the regular season for a reason. They were also called frauds in the regular season for a reason as well, because I do think that they took advantage of teams when they were at their lowest. But this win goes ahead and proves that, okay, like BLG, as good as they are, they're not unbeatable, and if BLG is not unbeatable, then nobody is unbeatable at this tournament. LNG can take down a lot of teams, and now because of this, they're only one win away from making it to the quarterfinals, and maybe as one of the first teams to do so. That would be gigantic for them. But for BLG, obviously not the end of the tournament or anything like that, but 1-1 as a start for one of the tournament favorites is just not really an ideal set of circumstances, mostly because you actually got a really good draw here. LNG is a very beatable team. They're one of the weaker 1-0 teams, and you still actually just kind of got pulled apart by them in terms of the macro and the team fighting in the later half of this game, mostly the team fighting. You have one really nice fight around Grubs early on in the game that lets you get all 6, and that's looking great, but once again, the Grubs curse strikes again. I swear, like multiple times at this tournament, we've seen teams like give everything to try to win grub fights, get it, and then do nothing with it throughout the rest of the game, not be able to take any towers because they don't have any pressure, and generally just lose the game, lose tempo. Grubs have actually been a huge bait over the course of this tournament, and I was talking about that in the playoffs as well, because after that, they basically lost all sense of pressure that they had. Knight and Bin, who were dominating in lane, ended up being significantly less useful as the game went on. Bin was still pretty okay, but he wasn't doing nearly as much as the Rumble on the other side, which is not ideal. You had players like Elk that were doing damage, but couldn't cut through the front line back enough or fast enough, and had to be scared of the Rumble being able to jump on top of them, essentially, and just kind of blow him up. So he had to play very scared in all of these fights, alongside, of course, the Nocturne. And then you have Wei and On, who were constantly diving in and just not really connected with the rest of the team. That's kind of the benefit of drafting the comp that LNG drafts, is if you have Rumble and Yone in the mid line here, separating the front and the back line of BLG, you can have your, you know, Ashe taking down the Vi and the Rel all the time, separating that front line. You can have the others like Rumble and like Nocturne like just completely dominating the Jin on the backline and really not allowing them to be able to play the game. So overall, BLG just looking completely out of sorts. I don't know what it was. On's going to get dead of the game, by the way, but I think you could realistically give this to Wei as well. On just got caught out and picked a lot more often. That is definitely something that you worried about going into this tournament. That happened a lot more this year than it did last year for him, and I still think that the inconsistencies in the mid game are going to catch up to him, and they did catch up to him in this game, but Wei also deserves some credit for just not being very good in this game, being in the wrong place at the wrong time and not being connected with the rest of the team in terms of the team fights. Knight was not very good in these team fights. He was really good in lane, but Orianna is not supposed to dominate lane and then fall off in the late game. That's not how this is supposed to go. And so for BLG, obviously I think they're going to be able to turn it around. They're the back-to-back LPL champions for a reason. This is a team that still is probably a tournament favorite, but there are cracks in the armor for sure. This is not an unbeatable team, and we're seeing that here, but really huge win for LNG. They, again, are now one best of 3 at the very least, away from making it to the quarterfinals as one of the first teams out of the Swiss stage. If they're one of the best teams in the Swiss stage, that is a huge accomplishment for an LNG team that at times was looking very shaky domestically. So very excited to see that, and I mean, I'm just so happy Scout was able to make it, because this team at full power is clicking like not really a lot of others at this tournament. But moving on now to game number 2, and this is likely the game of the day on paper, back-to-back for one of these teams in terms of the tough opponents that they've had to face, but it's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports, and Gen.G just barely is going to pick up the victory in this one. What a back-and-forth fun game between these two teams. I was really happy to see both of them really step up. There was a lot of fun back and forth action, as I said, but it wasn't because both teams were throwing. More so it was because both teams, I think, understood exactly how they were supposed to play this out. Gen.G got a couple of good early game leads. They got a ton of gold onto Chovy after some really big mistakes coming in the middle of the map from Top Esports, but TES does a great job in the mid game to be able to not only keep their gold lead, but to bring back some of that pressure. 369 and Tian in particular were the power point of the map. Tian doing a great job of playing towards that Rumble. Rumble continues to be a massive power pick at this tournament. We continue to see the strength of that champion, specifically in the mid game where it's just kind of blown every other top laner completely out of the water in terms of pressure, and 369 was really strong. We were going into the late game with the expectation that Top Esports was in a better position to be able to close out this game, even with Chovy being very strong on the Yone on the other side of this matchup, but Top Esports could not quite hang on. At the end of the day, it's a ridiculously good fight from Gen.G in the middle of the map, where they're able to catch out Jackie Love, where Pays is able to dive onto the backline, understanding that they don't have enough damage to kill him, even if he does play super aggressive, and a perfectly played fight later. Now Gen.G is out to a lead, and yes, there were a couple of over-eager moments. They almost throw it with an over-eager dive in the top lane with Chovy just dying for no reason, and, you know, Top Esports actually getting some gold back, but execution aside, they were able to close this out relatively well, and honestly, I feel really good about both of these teams after this game. I think this is a really good sign for both of them. You could argue that the macro decisions and some of the micro decisions with players like Cream weren't ideal in this game, which we will definitely get into, but I think for the most part, there's really no other way to look at this game other than a battle between two of the best teams in the world, and that's what you wanted to see out of them. So let's talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Lehens for me. There was no question on this. As good as Chovy and Pays were, and trust me, they were excellent in this game. Chovy got an early lead. Pays was the late game dominator. The damage he was able to do on Kai'Sa was ridiculous. This was a phenomenal performance from Pays, very reminiscent of how he would play for a majority of the year in the LCK. There was just no other option other than Lehens, who was creating everything for this team on the Leona. It was just engage after engage after engage, good lockdown after good lockdown. I mean, this was an elite Leona game. I'm not a big fan of Leona in comparison to a lot of the other engagers. I think things like Rel, Nautilus, and Alistair are just better, especially in the mid to late game when you're trying to set up for a lot of these plays, but when you can play Leona like this, go ahead. It does not matter to me at that point. You've completely overwritten any argument that I could possibly have. A great game from Lehens, the primary playmaker, and a guy who continues to show that everybody's sleeping on him. Maybe not as much anymore, but man, like the conversation about him before this season was starting was ridiculous as the reigning LCK MVP last year in Summer Split, and he has very much lived up to the hype. But Pays was excellent. This is exactly how you play Kai'Sa. Like, this is your pinpoint perfect Kai'Sa game where you know exactly when to dive onto the backline and be this assassin to take out the enemy AD carry, but also you can play front to back and you can do a lot of damage before fights with a lot of good poke. This is just a Kai'Sa masterclass. Pays is ridiculously good, and for some reason, the casters and everybody seem to be talking about this narrative where he's just kind of been okay over the course of this year. I want to remind people he got my MVP in the summer split for the entirety of the LCK. This is not just some AD carry. This is one of the best players in the world, at minimum top 10 in the world right now, and he continues to show up and play like that. Chovy was excellent in the early game here. That fight in the middle of the map where he's able to catch out Jackie Love perfectly on the Jhin being overextended. I mean, it was a game-winning fight from Chovy, and he was the one who ended up finding that angle. This guy is just ridiculous when you give him anything that's a playmaker. Now, top side of the map was definitely more questionable. That's where Top Esports was able to get their leads in the mid game. Canyon, in particular, I don't think had a great game here on Maokai, but that's kind of par for the course. People have talked about his tanks being a lot more inconsistent. I'm a bit higher on his tank play than it seems the general consensus is, but obviously he's better on carries, and I want to see him on carries. I don't want to see him on Maokai the whole tournament. Keen was also excellent in team fights, but really struggled in the early laning phase. It's fine. Like, that's, you learn to live with that. He was targeted a lot in the early part of the game, in the mid game, to get 3-6-9 ahead. And so, again, you just have to live with that. But top side, definitely more questionable. The bottom side of the map, definitely the stars for Gen.G in their win here. But for Top Esports, certainly nothing to cry about. This was a really good performance. And honestly, there was a world in which you walked out of this with a win over Gen.G, which would have been absolutely massive for your tournament hopes. 3-6-9 and Tian were unbelievably good in the early game. 3-6-9 obviously reflects that in terms of his scoreline on the Rumble. This champion continues to be unbelievably good. I don't really understand why people refuse to adapt and accept that Rumble is one of the best champions at this entire tournament. I get that he got nerfed, but clearly not enough for him to be out of the meta. Even if there were, talks and comments about how Rumble was weaker, which I was making as well, at some point, like, you just have to adapt and understand that Rumble is, like, one of the best champions at this tournament, because that is all we are seeing. 3-6-9 was excellent when given gold. He just missed a lot of his equalizers in the late game, and that is, unfortunately, a bit of a player diff. 3-6-9 has been very questionable in terms of his team fighting in the summer split, and that has carried over to Worlds, unfortunately. But for Tian, I think his scoreline doesn't do him justice for just how active he was in the early game. This guy continues to be an absolute menace, like, pre-20 minutes. He's still very good after that as well, but specifically in those early games, he's just an absolute menace. It is very difficult to find situations in which he's actually being outpaced. Again, Sejuani ended up not being as useful because the carries in the back half of the game weren't quite as useful, and that's just generally how it ends up going. But Tian, 3-6-9, definitely not the problem. Dud of the game was a little bit more tricky, though. I think it could go to anybody in the bottom side of the map. If we talked about Gen.G playing a really good game, we have to talk about Top Esports kind of struggling in that phase. Mako is going to get my dud of the game here on the Rel. It felt like he was the one that was the most useless in terms of the plays that he was making. Even Cream and Jackie Love had some really good moments in fights. They just couldn't stay consistent. But Mako, I just don't think had a good game. And I've been talking Mako up as the best support in the world. Well, he goes into Pays and Lehens, one of the best bot lanes in the world, and he looks a slight bit outclassed. Lehens was just better than him on the engagers this game, even from relatively neutral states, and Mako on a stronger and more useful champion, in my opinion. So certainly something to continue to monitor. But Cream, some mechanical mistakes. I mean, getting killed in the early game just by being way too far forward, getting baited into Fog of War with Chovy just kind of not ideal. It's really not a good situation. He ults into a wall in the final fight. Just some execution differences. I don't think Lucian is, like, ridiculously strong. I don't think he's ridiculously weak either. I think this was Cream very much just not performing, and Jackie Love not necessarily looking quite as good as he did in day number 1 on the Jhin. But overall, I'm still feeling good about Top Esports. They were able to get and maintain a lead against Gen.G for a good portion of this game. They just weren't able to close it out. It's just an execution diff. You're playing the best team in the world, and you weren't quite able to 5v5 them in the way that you would want. I think this team is still very good, and honestly, I've been significantly more encouraged by their games at Worlds than I would be discouraged. But for Gen.G, really nice win. You get to 2-0 again, very similar to what I said about LNG. You're now one game away or one series away from being able to make it to the quarterfinals. That should be obvious for this roster with how their year has gone so far, but it's really nice to see that the finals loss has not affected them in the slightest. Then moving on now to game number 3, and boy, did we have a banger here. I did not expect this game to be so close. It was awesome. We had a fun matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports and the number 1 seed from the LCK in Hanwha Life Esports. And HLE is just barely going to come out on top in this one. What a fun back and forth game. The numbers on the screen very much do not do justice just how unbelievably close this game was for the entirety of it. HLE gets out to an early lead, and you think, oh, this game's over. You're looking at a 5v5 comp of Sejuani, Smolder, Braum, even Ashe. Like, Jax can, like, pressure in a side lane and still, compete in some of these fights. Like, the moment HLE get an early lead, you think this game is just done and dusted, but they make a pretty big mistake. They overstay on a dive on the top side. G2's able to capitalize, one Baron later, and all of a sudden, the gold is basically equalized. And then you look at second Baron, all of a sudden, G2 comes in, they steal that. It's now G2 who is actually in complete control. They're starting to pick apart HLE. They're starting to not allow these front-to-back 5v5s, to not allow Smolder to end up taking over the game, and then they start pressuring their tempo, but they just don't have the same kind of map presence that, a team like HLE have. Unfortunately, in a game like this, G2's comp is much more difficult to execute, and really that's what it came down to, is G2 had to do so much in the late game to constantly be on top of HLE. The moment that HLE got any sort of front-to-back 5v5 or 4v4 or forced anyone into a side lane that couldn't contribute in a fight, all of a sudden Zeka was able to take over in these, big front-to-backs, and the game wasn't particularly close in that aspect. And so it very much just was a difference in styles, but for HLE, they're going to feel very lucky, I think, to get out of this one with a victory, because there were moments in time that felt like they were going to lose this to G2, which would have been a bit of a disaster. But I really want to say this off the rip. I don't mean this in any sort of negative way towards EU. Both of these statements are going to be true. I'm going to say two statements here. A lot of people are going to take them as mutually exclusive. They are not. Caps is a really good player. Yone is so broken. This champion is so unbalanced and so auto-win in so many circumstances. It's actually ridiculous just how much Yone does on this current patch. Caps obviously played him incredibly well, and Caps was awesome this game. I don't want to take anything away from Caps. I just really want to laugh about how ridiculously broken Yone is and how clear it is. But for HLE, player of the game, it's got to go to Zeka. I mean, when you're talking about the focus of the team fights, when you're talking about the focus of the game, it was the Smolder. The moment that he ended up getting to like 4 or 5 items, it was like, if you take a front-to-back fight against HLE, you just instantly lose. There's no way for G2 to be able to win without getting picks earlier on or pulling them apart in some way, shape, or form. Making sure Zeka is not the primary focal damage, threat of the fight was the only way for G2 to end up winning. Now, credit to them, they obviously were able to do that for a lot of this game. They were able to do a great job of controlling objectives, but then specifically the moment that HLE is able to get that Infernal Soul, with G2 making a decision, I guess, to try and counter it with getting top inhib and then losing 2 and, kind of throwing away a lot of the pressure on the map. That was the moment the game really fell apart for them, and Zeka was the focal point. Like, whether or not you want to say that he played this game perfectly, he did 60,000 damage in this game. He was like 550 CS by the end of this game. Zeka was in such a dominant position, and they really relied on him to be able to win, but it was everybody. Viper was great this game in the team fights. I think he's going to go really undervalued for just how good he was in the front to back, even though like Smolder was the focal point. You need secondary damage, and Ashe definitely was that secondary damage. I would give a huge stayed cool to Doran in the top lane, who did not have a particularly good early game here on the Jax as is expected into the Poppy matchup, but man, when he got online, and in fact, him in the side lanes is kind of what saves the game here for HLE, being able to match Caps, being able to match Broken Blade and Yike, and a lot of these other players that might want to go and be a little bit more aggressive trying to base raise. Doran stopping Caps' teleport in that final fight is what ends up ending the game, and so big credit to Doran for staying cool. Peanut and Delight were fine. Peanut was great in the fights. I wish he would have been a little bit more clinical in terms of smiting the objectives, but at the end of the day, HLE is able to come out on top. However they got there, and they're going to be moving to 2-0, but for G2, I was talking going into this game about how I needed to see them at the very least hold their own against Hanwha Life, because they've been talking this entire year about how their expectations are winning Worlds, about how this team has been together now for 600 days, and if they're not capable of winning Worlds this year, then they're never going to be capable of winning Worlds. I've been a doubter, obviously. I don't think that that's even that unpopular of an opinion over the course of this year. I've not believed that this team has the talent to win the entire tournament, but this is as close as I've gotten to being convinced. Like, this was an elite performance against one of the best teams in the entire world. Caps was perfectly using side lane tempo and playing the Yone to absolute perfection. Yes, that champion is busted, but you still have to operate him at a high level, and Caps was able to do that. This is one of the best games Caps has played specifically in the last 3 months. We were talking about his form going into Worlds not being as good as maybe some of the other best players in the world. Well, here you go. He's going to be able to turn it around. You have players like Broken Blade, who I thought had a great game on the Poppy. Yike, able to get some miraculous Baron steals. They controlled Barons for basically the entirety of this game. Even Hans and Mickey, I thought, were really solid in terms of the engages, even if Hans didn't get to do all that much throughout this game. But I do have to give a dud of the game somewhere because that's just how this goes. I've never not given a dud of the game. It's gonna go to Mickey. Like, I don't think Mickey played bad. I think he was a little over-eager with some of the flank angles he was looking for. Unfortunately, at times he was a bit disconnected from the rest of the team. Oftentimes he's just dying first in these fights, but that kind of is his job on the rel, and so, you know, I'm not trying to criticize Mickey. I don't think he had a horrible game or anything like that. I just have to give it to someone, and Mickey was probably the player that did the least on G2 in terms of positive impact towards their success, but we will see what happens going forward. As much as I'd like to sit here and say that, oh, G2 has proven that they are a team that can now compete to make the semifinals of the World Championships, historically speaking, there is some precedent towards this, and people might forget about it because of the reason I'm about to explain, but last year at the World Championships, they started 2-0. They were able to beat teams like Dplus KIA. They beat Weibo Gaming, who ended up making World Finals. They just couldn't quite hang on. They end up losing to Gen.G. They end up, obviously, very famously losing to Energy, and they can't quite get past Bilibili Gaming, and all of a sudden, they're not even in quarterfinals, and they looked really good against BLG. They looked really good against Gen.G. I remember we walked out of those series, you know, especially the Gen.G one, being like, oh my god, like, this team actually can compete with the best teams in the world. Gen.G had won the LCK in back-to-back splits, and we were talking just about how G2 was able to go toe-to-toe with them, and yet nobody remembers that because it all came crumbling down. They ended up not making quarterfinals, and regardless of how quote-unquote close they were to winning, people forgot because the results weren't there. I'm really hoping that that's not going to be the case this year, and honestly, there's really no reason to believe it will be. I think this year's Worlds is weaker than last year's. I think generally the teams on the borderline are significantly worse than they were last year. I think G2 has a shot to be a top 4, top 5 team at this tournament, and I think they played like it in this game, but my point that I'm trying to make is not that G2 is in danger or anything like that, but rather they need to keep this up. It's all well and good to play like this against Hanwha Life and lose, but now that you've lost, you've got to be able to keep that mental, turn it around, and keep the form going. Not only do you want to get into the quarterfinals, you want to be able to compete at a high level like you did in this game. If you play like this the rest of the tournament, you're going to be a real contender for top 4, but for HLE, this team is awesome. Like, obviously, they had the easier to execute comp, and they were able to execute on it, but they understood their win condition. They understood that G2 had to pull them away in side lanes, had to play more of a macro style, and all they had to do was try to 5v5, and they forced it over and over again. They understood where exactly they needed to be, and they played towards it. This was a great game from both teams, and I'm excited for both of them moving forward. But then moving on now to game number 4, and it's our first of the 0-1 matchups of the day. Of course, these are arguably more important than the 1-0 matchups in terms of scoreline, because losing this puts you one series away, one best of 3 away from being eliminated from the tournament. You basically have to be perfect throughout the rest of this tournament to even make it to the quarterfinals, and these first 2 teams that are going to be playing off in the 0-1 stage, neither of them want to be there. It's the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming, taking on the number 2 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid, and Weibo Gaming is going to pick up the victory. They're going to move to 1-1. They're going to keep a lot of their hopes alive. This is a team that I think definitely wants to make the quarterfinal stage, probably wants to make the semifinals of Worlds. This is a better team than they were last year, and they made the finals last year, and so I imagine the expectations are pretty high for them, but it is unfortunately at the cost of Team Liquid, who just, I hate to say it, they're just not getting it done at this tournament. They had the lead in this game. They had everything in the palm of their hands, and some horrible positioning, being out of position, late to fights, not being connected with the team, some just weird stuff. All of that is gone. All of it just disappears in the mid game, and everything good that they did at the beginning of this game just becomes null and void, and it sucks for Team Liquid. This is the second time this tournament that they've had a big lead in the early game, maybe not a big lead in game 1, but a lead in the early game that they've not been able to hold on to, and then they just tilt out of their minds into losing the game. I have completely lost all faith and all hope in Team Liquid. I am, quite frankly, just a little bit done with their performance. It is clear that these guys are just way too nervous to ever perform at a good level on the international stage. I don't know if that's something that is going to be be fixed, but for a team that was trash talking all year, they're just not showing up at this tournament, quite frankly. And I get that their opponents have been tough, Weibo Gaming and LNG, and they're able to really fight off these teams. And are they favorites in either of these games? Probably not. I didn't pick them to win either of these games, but in the positions that they were in at 15, 20 minutes, losing these games against teams that aren't Gen.G or Bilibili, like, that's a disaster. You have to be able to convert on the advantages you are getting, and they're just not able to do that. But Weibo had so many positives going for them in the back half of this game that I want to talk about as well. Player of the game kind of has to go to Breathe in the top lane. This was just a masterclass, a giant top gap, a top die performance onto Impact, which is never really ideal. Breathe not only gets a solo kill in this game as Gnar into Renekton, which first of all is a bit of a disaster for the Renekton, but he probably should have gotten two. There was another circumstance where Impact survives on like 1 health because Breathe tried to predict a flash and ended up missing his boomerang, but he probably gets 2 different solo kills this game if he actually lands his Q, and that's a disaster for Impact. This is the LCS MVP that is getting abused by what I would consider to be the weakest of the Eastern top laners at this tournament. Breathe has been super inconsistent throughout this entire year. I like Breathe. I've been a big Breathe defender over the course of his career. I've definitely pushed for it in the LPL domestically, but he had one of his worst splits ever here in summer. I mean, the guy was just hyper inconsistent and losing constantly, especially in lane. That was his problem, and so for him to just completely gap Impact, it's a disaster for Impact, and it's awesome for Breathe. If he can keep this up and kind of be a little bit of what the Shy was for this team, obviously I'm not expecting him to be what the Shy was last year for this team, but if he can be like a dominant threat that's actually better at Worlds than he is domestically on the top side, that's huge, because again, I think the rest of this team is better than what Weibo was playing with last year, better than what the Shy was playing with last year on Weibo Gaming. So credit to Breathe, great game from him. I really want to shout out Crisp. He got caught multiple times at the beginning of this game on the Renata, and that's actually what gave Team Liquid their lead in the early game, was Crisp just being out of position, and I was ready to criticize him super heavily because he had a bad Worlds last year, and he continues to play very, very well domestically, but it just doesn't seem to be translating internationally, at least on Weibo Gaming. But oh my goodness, those hostile takeovers, those ultimates in the back half of the game, they won fights on their own. Single-handedly, Crisp was able to completely determine whether or not this game was going to be easy or hard for Team Liquid, and he chose hard. He chose difficult because Crisp was amazing in terms of those ultimates. So big credit to him for staying in the game. He is a great team fighter, one of the best as a support in the entire world. He's always been really good at that. We praise his creative flank angles on champions like Rakan in the past, but sometimes it gets lost that he's just a smart player in terms of how to play 5v5s, and that comes out on champions like Renata as well. Some gigantic shockwaves coming in from Xiaohu. Sometimes the Orianna lacked a little bit of damage. That's why I was a little bit lower on the control mage meta, but we'll get to why I think Orianna is still a superior pick over Syndra, why I think that take has continuously proven to be correct over the course of this tournament. Xiaohu just was way more useful than APA in the back half of this game, even with APA having like triple his gold in the mid game. Xiaohu was pretty solid here. Light was very good other than the time that he flashed in to immediately die in a fight. Outside of that, he was really solid, and Tarzan was fine this game. Again, it's kind of funny because Tarzan was such a hyper carry for this team in the domestic season, in the regular season, and he's kind of just been a guy so far at Worlds, but hopefully he'll be able to step up. Overall for Weibo, this is a big win. 0-2 would have been a disaster, and that's why it is a disaster for Team Liquid. The only solace that they are going to have is that they are almost certainly the best 0-2 team. Like, regardless of how things shape up, unless T1 ends up losing, there is nobody else that it could even theoretically go 0-2 that I don't think Team Liquid is better than, so that's a good sign, but it also just shows that this team is underperforming right now. APA gets monstrously fed in the early part of this game on the Syndra. Syndra is obviously a champion that I've kind of gone to war with on this channel. I've been very anti-Syndra. I think she's incredibly overhyped right now. I think people are just itching to find any sort of change to the meta, and I think Western teams in particular are falling into the trap of over-reading patch notes rather than under-reading patch notes, and I think APA, as much as I'd like to sit here and blame this game on Syndra, I think a lot of it was his gameplay, but part of it was that Syndra just isn't as useful as Orianna in the back half of the game. Even with Ori having half, like, APA's gold, like, genuinely not even nearly on the same level as what the Syndra had. Ori Shockwave is infinitely more valuable than anything that Syndra has if you're able to land it on multiple members, and APA kind of experienced that, but it wasn't just the Syndra pick. I mean, it was him being late to fights. It was him randomly being in a side wave while Impact and Umti are being super aggressive, and clearly the call is to go in. I don't know what's going on. It's just disconnect. There are fights where not only is he late, but he's not doing any damage. He's not actively being the primary carry. It's nerves. There's nothing else to explain it other than what we saw in game number 1, which is APA just not quite being ready for this stage. I hate to say it, but sometimes players just get in their own heads too much. He's clearly mega tilted from just being at this tournament. It is overwhelming to him, and at least it's coming out in his gameplay. I don't really know what to say. I'm not trying to speak for the guy. I don't know him personally, but the game is just, it's too fast for him right now, and he's just not able to catch up. These late game fights are just horrendous from him, even with a ton of gold. I do want to give a ton of credit to Core JJ and Jan. I think they were by far the best players on Team Liquid in this series. That has been a constant and a regular throughout this year. Core was amazing in some of these fights on the Nami. I know I've been a little bit lower on Core, but this was a great game from him. And Jan still was very good on the Lucian. He had to do his absolute best to try and dodge these hostile takeovers because he would instantly lose the game if he got hit once, which is why his scoreline looks so, like, meek. He only participated in 8 kills because he had to spend the entire game trying to avoid the Renata, which is absolutely tragic, but he was doing a lot of damage when he actually was allowed to do damage. It just wasn't ideal. T was also not really all that great in the back half of this game, but only so much you can do on the Sejuani. Overall, Team Liquid, they just have to figure something out. They're going down their 0-2 now. I've lost all confidence that this team is going to make any sort of run for quarterfinals. I think they were the North American team that had the best shot going into this tournament. You know, FlyQuest definitely has overtaken that in terms of my idea, because not only is 0-2 just a disastrous start, but the mental on this team seems to be completely and utterly destroyed, and I just don't think they're going to be able to get that back over the course of 1 week. And then for Weibo Gaming, this is a necessary win, but there still are a lot of things they need to improve on. Their early game was still very weak, and I think capitalizing on some of these situations needs to be a bit more clinical, but I still have faith in Weibo Gaming. This team's always going to be flippy, but on any given day, they can beat anyone. But then moving on now to our second half of the day, and we kick it off with what was my personal most anticipated game of the day, the number 4 seed from the LCK in T1, taking on the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Pain Gaming. And unfortunately for Pain, they were just a tad bit outmatched in this one. They did put up at least a fun fight. I'm not going to say a good fight, but they certainly put up a fun game. Titan ends up getting first blood in the straight 2v2 with Kalista Nico into Gumayushi's Draven, which is genuinely ridiculous, but basically from that moment onwards, it just was downhill, 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 until T1 eventually just ran over Pain. This was expected. If this went any other way, I would be talking about how T1 is actually a disaster, about how their form in the LCK is even worse than we thought it was going to be, and that they had no chance of even making it to the semifinals, let alone, like, this was a team I was going to be scared of going to the quarterfinals. I'm not even talking if they lost. I'm talking if they struggled at all to win this one. But no struggle. This is exactly what we should have been seeing from T1, and I think there are some good takeaways from it. Not nearly as many, I guess, interesting takeaways as some of the other games that we saw today, but player of the game for me, gonna go to Owner. I think this is up for debate. I think Owner was the most active player on the map here. Vi is an incredibly strong champion right now. I have continued to champion Vi, and I know people get really mad when I do this, and if you're one of these people that hates when I, talk about the things I got right before the tournament that I got criticized a lot for, then skip ahead about a minute and a half, because I understand that there are a lot of people that are like, oh, he just brags about his takes. All right, well, skip ahead. I don't care. But Vi being the high priority over Jarvan, like, obviously, this was so obvious to me going into the tournament. Everybody was so on the Jarvan hype train, hell, even the Xin Zhao hype train, and I was just like, I don't really get it. Like, what does Jarvan do that Vi doesn't do more consistently right now? Jarvan is way more reliant on items. Both of them really want to snowball, but Vi is a little bit more consistent in terms of the early game, and so it makes their snowballing easier. It just felt very weird to me to see all this hype around Jarvan when he got a buff that, quite frankly, consequentially didn't matter. His name was on the list of champions that got buffed. Like, nothing actually changed about Jarvan. People just remembered he existed, and, it makes a lot of sense to me that Eastern teams, and quite frankly, every team at this tournament, they're just going to prefer Vi, and that is carried over. Obviously, I was a big proponent of Yone, but everybody was. I was a big proponent of Rumble, saying that his nerfs were not nearly as effective going into this tournament. I've also been talking about Smolder, and we've seen that champion do really well so far in the main stage. It just seems like a lot of the criticism I got on that meta report video has actually turned out pretty poor. Like, I've done really well, as we do every single year. So it's good to see that. It's good to see that a lot of the, I guess, more educated teams at this tournament, or at least the teams that are typically associated with being, good drafters, that they actually agree with a lot of my opinions on a lot of the champions. That is a good sign, but Vi really showing up, being able to move around the map, snowball the game out of control. I mean, the dive potential, the ability to create in the early game, the ability to snipe in the back line in the back half of the game is what I was trying to say. All of that is just so good for Vi. She does so many different things. I don't think she's quite as good as like a Sejuani, but she's definitely up there. She is definitely a very strong pick in my opinion, and especially pairing it with things like Yone and Rumble. Yone Rumble kind of feels like the Exodia duo right now if you're able to get both. It's just very difficult to deal with in the back half of the game because Rumble can blow you up even from a disadvantaged state in some of these team fights. He can be down a ton of gold from laning phase. You could be down in members, but one equalizer, Rumble getting on your carry in the backline, all of a sudden the fight is basically done. And then obviously Yone is the strongest champ in the game. He can team fight. He's the best split pusher in the game. He can 1v1. He can duel. There's just no weakness to Yone right now. He does a little bit of everything, and Faker played him well. Guma and Keria looked good. The very aggressive Draven Renata that ends up getting punished in the 2v2. Like, Titan does get that first blood, but after that looks basically perfect. Keria's Renata is genuinely insane. Renata, another champion that looked really good across this entire day. Certainly something to continue to monitor, but, T1 in general just having a very well-rounded, very good macro, clean, fast victory. This is what you would expect against Pain Gaming, but for Pain, you at least got that first blood. You looked interesting for a little bit against T1. They talked about it in the pre-game interview. They were just happy to be playing against T1. It's the first time, I believe, a CB LoL team has ever played T1. It's definitely the first time at Worlds. I don't know if it's the first time ever, but, good for Pain. I'm happy that they were able to get this game. A lot of the experience that I'm sure they were able to glean out of it was positive for them, but there are some negatives. Dinkedo is going to get done of the game for me on the Akali in the mid lane. The Akali just wasn't very good. When you're going to go for a really risky and aggressive comp like this, you have to be able to make it work early, and the Akali basically got no gold throughout the entirety of this game, and so really didn't have a lot of trouble. Dinkedo struggled playing against Kaney in the play-in stage 1v1. I did not think he stood a chance against Faker, and unfortunately that did end up coming into fruition. Karioka also continues to really struggle in the jungle. This was a player that, again, I had a very low grade on coming into this tournament, and unfortunately, at least in the main stage, that has definitely panned out. I just don't expect it to get better in terms of the matchups in the jungle. Weiser was kind of interesting. I don't think Titan and Curry were awful, but they couldn't really do anything. Kalista Nico is doomed the moment that Pain loses their gold lead, and so overall, it's what you would have expected from, a minor region team playing against T1. It's just kind of the anticipation, but Pain's not out of this tournament yet. They go down into that 0-2 gauntlet. Basically, everybody is going to be hoping and praying to dodge Team Liquid there. If they can do that, they're going to have a matchup against a team like potentially GAM or PSG or Mad Lions. Those, maybe not Mad, like that's probably not winnable, but, GAM and PSG, those are winnable games for Pain if everything were to go right. And so it's certainly not over for them yet, but T1 getting to that 1-1 stage, I imagine they're going to be a lot more comfortable coming off of a performance like this, but again, we need to see this kind of showing against someone that isn't Pain Gaming. The question has never been, can T1 beat the teams that are way worse than them? They did that very consistently in the LCK. It's really about, are they actually one of the best teams in the world? And that is still a question. But then moving on to game number 6 in our final 1-0 matchup of the day. It is probably one of the closer ones, I would say, in the 1-0 column, but definitely two teams that I think are going to be happy if they win it. It's Dplus KIA, the number 3 seed from the LCK, taking on the number 1 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest. And Dplus KIA is going to pick up the victory. I talked about this yesterday when we were previewing this matchup, where I said this was probably the best case scenario matchup for both of these teams. I think these are the two weakest 1-0 teams. LNG was kind of in that conversation for me, but obviously they proved today that that was not the case. And I think these two teams played like the two weakest 1-0 teams from day number 1. They both had a lot of weaknesses. They both made a lot of mistakes. And honestly, quite frankly, I hate both of their drafts. I think both of their drafts are just cooking way too much. I think both of them are trying way too hard, and I think both of them require way too much skill to execute. There are so many simple comps right now to go out and try and play, and I get for FlyQuest this is comfort, quote-unquote. Things like Amumu and Darius, like they are, picks that Inspired and Whippo have played a lot of. Inspired in particular has been a bit of an Amumu merchant, but you'll know if you've watched my LCS content, I think Amumu is garbage right now. I do not think that champion is particularly strong, especially at like above Sejuani as like a priority. It just doesn't really make any sense to me, but it's not like DK's draft is perfect. Silas, I think, is only particularly good because they drafted Amumu and because, Ashe is obviously very good. Leona's pretty good to steal as well. There are some pretty good ultimates to steal, but without Amumu there, if this was a Sejuani, I think Silas priority goes down quite a bit. I don't think Smolder Bot is particularly good right now. I think it's playable, certainly, but not into Ashe Leona. Like, you're going to get bullied out of that laning phase. Aiming should never be allowed to play this game, and as much as I like Yone, like, you're getting counterpicked by Darius on the top side because you picked it so early, and so I don't like either of these drafts. I think both teams completely trolled in draft. I think both of them completely trolled in game, both of them making mistake after mistake, but DK was just a little bit better in terms of their execution, and so they come out on top. Player of the game kind of has to once again go to Showmaker. This team is sitting at 2-0 off the back of Showmaker just being the best player on the Rift for 2 games. And as much as I love Showmaker, I just don't know how predictable or reliable of a strategy that is going to be moving forward. He was awesome here. Sylas, I think, is great, obviously, into Amumu, Ashe, Leona. Like, it's just such a good comp to draft Sylas in. I do think Sylas's numbers are a little bit lower than maybe you would expect them to be. Like, if you've seen Sylas at past World Championships or, you know, when he was good in Pro last year, like, you would expect Sylas's numbers to be a little bit higher, but he's still in an okay spot. I think you can pick him. He's kind of in a similar spot to a lot of these other mages that I think are playable. Very similar to LeBlanc, in my opinion, where very much can do a lot of damage, but typically has to be in a pretty good spot in order to do that. Luckily, Showmaker was in a very good spot this game, so he was doing a lot of damage in the back half of this, because if you get Sylas ahead, obviously he can still roll games. But, you know, big ups to Showmaker. Without Showmaker, DK is literally nothing. As much as people like aiming and Moham and Lucid and Kingin, this is a great example of why, like, Showmaker is the guy for DK, because he really was the one that was doing all the work for them in this game. I continue to get a lot of comments about aiming, you know, being underrated by me. This is a great example of what I think aiming is. His scoreline looks great on the Smolder. You would probably look at the post-game graph and see a lot of damage. I haven't seen it. I'm recording this right after the game is over, but he didn't do anything in this game. Like, he was around, but in the early and mid-game, he didn't exist. Now, part of that is the champion. Part of that is the matchup that he drafted himself into, but this is just generally how aiming plays every single game, regardless of the champion that he's on. He's a part of the team, and he does things in the late game. Like, you just have to live with that. Outside of that, Moham was pretty solid, couple of really good engages, got caught out a couple of times, but was really aggressive in this game, and I really like that. Lucid was something, man. Like, this was a game from Lucid. Probably one of the weaker games he's played in quite a while, and he got away with it because FlyQuest just didn't have the capability of punishing, but boy, a lot of those deaths were very costly and very bad for DK. FlyQuest had a real shot, a real chance to win this game, and a lot of that was Lucid just messing up over and over again. Kingin, also not particularly efficient on the Yone, but at the end of the day, he was still Yone. There was so much that champion got done just purely from existing in the first place. And so for DK, like, thank God you have Showmaker. That's the takeaway. Honestly, I do not think they're going to do well in the 2-0 bracket. I think Showmaker is awesome, and I think that the rest of this team has a lot to prove to me that they're even Worlds caliber, and that was the case going into the tournament. It's still the case now. And then for FlyQuest, brutal loss. You kind of had this game in the palm of your hands and then completely threw it away with a couple of, I guess, really mistimed backs, like Masu getting caught out backing on a ward after a really great top lane play is a disaster. Quad getting picked off there as well, and then obviously losing the subsequent fight, giving up Baron. It's kind of the end of the game immediately there, and it felt like FlyQuest actually had all the tempo in their hands going into that because DK was notoriously throwing, as they typically do. I would say FlyQuest does have a slightly more straightforward team fighting comp, but I didn't like how the casters were talking as if DK could not win a team fight. I think you get one Yone-Rel combo into Smolder, it's over. Like, absolutely DK with the Gold League can win a 5v5 team fight. You don't need to play the macro game when it comes to DK's comp, but FlyQuest comp is just so not good, in my opinion. I've talked a lot about how I think Syndra is overrated, but especially drafting it into Showmaker, like, he knows how to play against this champion, and as much as Quad did, a lot of the kills that you're seeing on the screen, they were cleanup. He wasn't exactly the most important carry. That was definitely Masu this game. And then Inspired on the Amumu. This is something that he pulled out over and over again. I talked about this in the meta report video. I basically had Amumu on the graphic purely because of FlyQuest and Inspired because he plays this champion so much. I don't get it. Like, I'm sure someone can illuminate it to me. The ultimate's pretty good, but look, you got countered by Sylas, and now all of a sudden Amumu is much more of a hindrance than he is a help on the team. I don't have anything else to say. I just do not think this champion is nearly as good as FlyQuest seems to think this champion is. Weibo picks the Darius on R5 to try to counter the Yone and ends up playing like an absolute psychopath. He's going to get dead of the game. This is your typical Blippo game. We saw this so much over the course of summer where, you know, you have to get into the mindset of, well, he's going to give up his life and give up a ton of gold in order to try to secure better map states for his team, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. In this game, it kind of worked at times, like the lane swap stuff at the beginning of the game. He got really punished, but so did Kingin, and then Obviously, he got caught out multiple times as that game continued to go on. Also, I want to make a note, there was a weird cut there. If you hear background noises, my neighbors are mowing their lawn. I can't do anything about it. I usually try to record when they're not doing that, but you got to get these Worlds videos out, and so I'll try to get as much of it out in post as I can, but if you hear any rumbling in the background, I do apologize, but yeah, Weibo I don't think was particularly good in this game, just getting caught out over and over again and just being too far forward. I understand his mentality of wanting to be aggressive, and oftentimes like trading your life can even be valuable if you get something else, or if you can set up a good like lane situation for yourself or for somebody else on the map, but generally speaking, the Darius did nothing throughout this game. There was one pick where it was like, oh, I get where the Darius is at now, but outside of that, just not really a lot to go off of. Overall, I just don't like FlyQuest draft. I do not like Western teams meta read at this tournament. I think generally speaking, when you're talking about all of the teams in the West, specifically North America, I think they came into this tournament with the worst meta read of any region by far, including the minor regions. They were so obsessed with the patches and with the buffs and the nerfs that all of these champions got over the past couple of weeks, and they just have they've overcorrected. A lot of these teams that have stuck closer to what the summer split meta was have been winning, and North American teams have been really struggling because their meta read, quite frankly, is atrocious. And so, so much for live patches, right? That was what we were hoping to fix. But at the end of the day, Fly's got to be able to clean this up. It's all up to them. Like, they're making tiny mistakes, and they're really NA's only chance of getting out of groups, and so they're now down at 1-1. DK, though, at 2-0, like I said, probably going to get trounced in that 2-0 bracket, but at the very least, they're there. Showmaker's playing like an animal right now. I just don't really have a lot of faith in this team outside of him. But then moving on now to game number 7, and two teams that are kind of notorious for being very aggressive and also very not clean, which makes for a fun experience. We have the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic, taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports, and again, pretty predictably, Fnatic is going to be able to pick up the victory here. I think it would have been a pretty big upset if GAM was actually able to take them down. Fnatic did struggle in the early game here. GAM did a great job of getting resources onto their solo laners quickly in this one. We saw the flaws of Fnatic's draft really early on into this game. Obviously, it ended up helping them out as the game continued to go further along, but only once they started getting gold. A better team here would have made it, I think, a lot harder for Fnatic to be able to win this game, but GAM just didn't have the, let's just call it resources, the hands, to be able to punish Fnatic for a lot of the mistakes that they were making, and quite frankly, the risky draft that they end up going for in this game. I just want to do a quick aside. I know I've already talked a bit about this, but I really want to make a point to make it known how I feel. I think Western teams at this tournament right now are like fine mechanically. I think that they actually are good enough to be able to compete with a lot of the other teams. Genuinely, I don't think I can remember the last time it felt like there was such a drastic meta read difference between the West and the East. The Korean and Chinese teams seem to have a really good read on what is working, and mostly because they haven't switched up too much. They've incorporated a lot of the new picks into their arsenal, but they've not completely eliminated a lot of the things that were working for them or that we know are strong and that we know work. Whereas I think the Western teams are super willing to just like throw out a lot of the data they've had over the course of this year and go to completely new metas. And quite frankly, we're seeing Western teams get super punished for it. I already talked a bit about how I think Jarvan should be lower priority. I think it's correct that a lot of teams are prioritizing things like Vi over Jarvan. We see Fnatic go for the Jarvan here, and it ends up working out for them in the late game, mostly because Fnatic is better than GAM. But we saw the weakness of Jarvan in the early game here. He was down like 40 CS on this Zyra. Like, it's not like this was a good matchup. A good jungler on this Zyra would have completely taken this Jarvan out of the game, but unfortunately Levy had a horrible game on the other side of this, which we will definitely talk about. But we're seeing similar things. Talked about it a bit in the FlyQuest series. It's just something I wanted to note. I think GAM had all the resources in this game. This should have been a 25-minute win for them. You had a Smolder that had a ton of gold. You had a Jax that was really strong. Jax, one of the champions that did get buffed, that I do think is in a really good spot right now. Overall, I'm just not really sure why Western teams are so intent on tinkering, because I think they've over-tinkered and, found themselves in a spot that has made them non-competitive with a lot of the Eastern teams at Worlds. But again, GAM's just not the kind of team that can punish that. Just wanted to do that quick aside for a second, but let's talk about the game itself. Player of the game is going to go to Noah in the bot lane. It can't really go to anybody else. He plays Ziggs here. His Ziggs has always been okay. I've always felt him more comfortable on things that don't need to be primary carries. I think that's always when he has struggled. I've always really liked his Ezreal. That's always kind of been his signature champion, at least in my eyes. I know the Aphelios comes to mind for a lot of other people, people, but to me, the Ziggs kind of fits into that mold of just kind of plays along with the rest of the team, can be whatever he needs to be, can be a resource carry in the early game, in fact, really likes to have resources in the early game, especially in a lane swap meta, and can do stuff in the late game, but isn't relied upon to be the #1 option. I think that that's a really nice role for Noah, and I think he played this game really well. I think without the damage he was able to put out on the Ziggs and the consistency he was able to take a lot of these objectives with, I think this game becomes a lot harder for Fnatic. Jun is the other player that I think you have to shout out. He was awesome. The bot lane in general was definitely the standout here for Fnatic. Jun has gotten better and better over the course of this year. I think Noah has really settled into his role ever since getting off of social media and allowing himself not to take that criticism too harshly. Overall, it's nice to see Fnatic's bot lane perform really well in a situation like this. Razork and Humanoid were fine. Humanoid continues to be all hands, no brain, and you just kind of have to live with that. It's just who he is as a player. He has relatively bad game sense, but at the end of the day, he's so good at the game that sometimes it doesn't matter. His team fights can still be really solid, and Oscar Rinnan got completely obliterated on the top side. We'll get to KIA in a second. This is a feels bad for KIA because he gapped Oscar Rinnan into the ground. This was a massive advantage. Obviously, a lot of attention and resources put into KIA by GAM, but still, Oscar got obliterated in this game, and it just didn't end up mattering. He was a lot more relevant as this game continued to go along. Gnar just generally is going to be fine in the back half of these games, even without resources, but definitely worth noting that he was the worst of these two top laners, and he was very much on pace to losing this team the game until bot lane ended up turning things around. So credit to Fnatic. I thought they played pretty well here, and then for GAM, they're just not good enough. Like, you were gifted a pretty gigantic lead. Quite frankly, this should have been an unlosable game. It wasn't unlosable, like, you didn't end up hitting the point where I thought it was quote-unquote unlosable, but you were in such a great spot. You were up like 2k gold, and all of it was on Jackson Smolder, and you're just like, okay, well, yeah, like, this is awesome. We have a scaling comp. We're playing Smolder, Kai'Sa, Jax, and we have a 2k gold lead at 15 minutes, and we have map pressure, and we have a Zyra's secure objectives. There's, like, no way we should ever lose this game, and yet, you know, Fnatic dragon stacking and just kind of allowing themselves to get free stats, and GAM not having the hands to be able to capitalize ended up being the difference here. Quite a few dead of the game candidates. I'm going to give it to Elio. I think it should go to either Levi or Elio here. Whoever you think deserves it more. Elio was a bit of a disaster on the rel. Couple of really good engages, and then, golly, like 4 or 5 that were just horrendously bad. They're going to point to the good ones and be like, he was actually okay, better than the scoreline. The bad ones, they absolutely do sell this scoreline for sure. Levi is also the other player that you obviously have to shout out, just not being very good. He got this gigantic lead in the early game individually on the Zyra and then did absolutely nothing with it as this game continued to go along. Had to play very safe to protect himself from the Ziggs the entire time and ended up just getting outplayed by Oscar Rinnan, who was down probably like 2,000 gold onto him. So not a great game. Emo's positioning is just horrendous. Like, this guy is just not very good. I don't mean to be negative, but like the fact that he's in the main stage of Worlds is crazy. His positioning on Smolder in some of these fights is genuinely ludicrously bad. I don't know why you don't just play patient. Easy Love was okay. Thought some of the ultimates from the Kai'Sa were too aggressive, and KIA was obviously a monster. A better team would have allowed KIA to completely obliterate this game, but overall, GAM just getting out-talented by Fnatic, and that's just kind of what you would expect, but Fnatic needs to clean up a lot. This team is not looking better than teams like FlyQuest and Team Liquid. I think they're all in the same bubble right now, where they all seem to have a really bad meta read, and they all seem to not be very consistent at closing out games. I think it's going to be something that plagues the West, and unfortunately, it does seem to be a common trend amongst all of them. But then moving on to our final game of the day, and it is a rematch from the play-in stage of the start of this World Championships. It's the #1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon, taking on the #3 seed from the LEC in Mad Lions Koi. And unlike that series in the play-in stage, PSG Talon is going to pick up a victory here. This is more of, I think, what we were expecting from these teams coming into this tournament. PSG was expected to be better than a team like Mad Lions. I had them in a whole tier above a team like Mad Lions. I thought PSG was going to be a lot closer to Fnatic and FlyQuest and Team Liquid and a lot of those, teams. It felt like they didn't necessarily have that at the beginning of this tournament, but lo and behold, all it takes is getting the Exodia comp right now on this patch in order to actually win a game like this. It honestly feels so easy at the current moment in order to win. If you draft Yone Rumble, you're probably going to win the game, and obviously there is more to it than that. The Kai'Sa and the Rel worked out well. The Maokai looked good. This is, I think, the exact same draft that Gen.G drafted earlier in the day, and so clearly this is just something that is working on this patch, but Rumble and Yone in particular just feel like world beaters right now as a duo. It feels like something that you cannot allow on the same comp. They give each other basically everything that both of them want. Yone wants a a consistent team member that can not only do magic damage, but can pressure in the mid game and can actively win team fights for the team because he's not a team fight star. And you want, as a Rumble player, a champion that can probably side lane more effectively than you can, that can match other top laners, but is also very dangerous on the physical side. Both of them just meet a lot of their requirements very easily, which makes them very dangerous as a duo. I'd be willing to look at the stats over the course of this tournament and guess that it's over like an 80 or 90% win rate when both of these two are on the same team. At least I would guess. Certainly in the main stage so far, it has been absolutely dominant when good teams are able to play the two, and that very much worked out here, but neither of them is going to get player of the game for me. Player of the game is going to go to Woody in the support position. This was supposedly the guy that was going to be the star. I remember coming out watching the full playoff tape of PSG and being like, I've watched PSG every year. I've watched Betty and Woody for quite a while, both individually and separately. Obviously, Betty in the LPL. Woody's just been in the PCS for a long time. He's been a high-level player in the PCS for a long time, and neither have ever looked as good as they did in the playoffs coming into this tournament. Woody, in particular, was a star domestically in the playoffs. He was the best player on PSG when you're talking about the tape that they showed in summer, and so I was really having high expectations for him coming into a tournament like this, and at least in the last few series, he has very much come in clutch. He destroyed 100 Thieves to qualify for the main stage. That was his best series of the play-ins, and here, he obliterates Mad Lions. Just everywhere on the map, fantastic engage after fantastic engage, just catching out pivotal members, Frescowy mainly, in a lot of these instances, and making it a lot more difficult for the Smolder to play. Woody is excellent, but you can't take away the contributions of Maple and Aja. I just have to say, Betty was also excellent in this one. He can sometimes go under the radar for this team because he isn't necessarily the most noticeable player in the entire universe. I think Maple, Aja, Gen.G, Woody, I think all of them probably have more attention on them than Betty does in terms of how this team ends up playing the game, but Betty has been really good for them over the past couple of months, and I think adding a stabilizing force down in the AD carry role has made their team a lot better. Gen.G was excellent going deathless on Maokai is always a good sign. Just PSG generally looking very good in this game, but for Mad Lions on the other side, a lot wrong, in my opinion, with how they ended up playing this. Not only do you draft, like, what I would consider to be a good comp, like, I said this on Twitter, but I think Mad Lions somehow, someway is the best meta read of every Western team at this tournament, which is objectively hilarious and also a very bad sign, because I don't think Mad Lions is, like, I don't think they know how to use that meta read in order to make it work. Like, I don't think they draft well. I just think they have a good understanding of what is strong and what is weak, but I do see the vision, right? You draft the Galio in order to try and shut down the Rumble early on and to try to help the Smolder in the later half of the game, and your entire game plan is to get Smolder into a good position to be able to carry. I get the idea behind it, but you gotta invest into that, and also, your mid laner can't be the worst player on the team. Frescowy was awful here. He's gonna get dud of the game. He's really just not been very good at this tournament. I know that there are some ups and downs for rookie players and young players in general, but man, like, even when he was playing Syndra in the play-in stage, I was really criticizing his laning phases and just how he was playing those out. It made me think that, yeah, look, Syndra's got a good win rate right now at this tournament, but it's going to go down, and that's exactly what's happened in the main stage. Frescowy was artificially inflating Syndra's win rate because the rest of his team was super good, but, you know, now that he's being given a lot of responsibility in a draft like this, he just can't come up clutch. He was really bad in this game, and he's going to need to be better if this team wants any shot at being able to win at this tournament. I think the bot lane was also completely invisible, and they were a big reason why they beat PSG in the first place. Supa and Alvaro were probably the two single best players in the play-in stage, full stop. They were just so exceptionally good at being able to get their own leads and destroying games in the back half, and they were just not relevant at all in this game. Alvaro did basically nothing. Supa was never allowed to play the game, and even when he wasn't really doing anything exceptionally good. I know that they are streaky players. It's kind of what you have to live with when you bring rookies to Worlds, but they're going to have to be better than whatever this was. This wasn't good enough. Elyoya, Mirwin, they weren't doing anything. Mirwin's ults were horrible in this game. Overall, I just feel not good about Mad Lions. It's so strange because I felt so good about them coming out of the play-in stage, and they've completely flipped that, and now my expectations for them are exactly what they were going into the tournament. I still think that they're likely better than the other minor region teams if they draw GAM or Pain Gaming in terms of their 0-2 matchup. I think that's going to be a good draw for them, but if they draw Team Liquid, I don't think they're winning that. Like, I don't think I think that's an 0-3 out of the tournament, which would not be ideal. But for PSG, this was a very good win. I'm glad to see this team starting to figure itself out. Obviously, I'd love to see what they can do without Yone and Rumble. That, again, just feels like Exodia right now. But still, a win is a win. Getting to 1-1 is good. Your opponent's not going to get easier after this. That is definitely for sure. But showing that you can beat a major region team and kind of live up to the hype that we thought you were going to have coming into this tournament by being about as good as a lot of the other, you know, LEC and Western teams, that's a good sign. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2024 Swiss Stage Day number 2 overview and analysis video. We are now breaking things up. Starting tomorrow, we are jumping into the best of 3 stage. Now, that's not to say every team is in the best of 3 stage. You have to have a 2 in one of your columns in order to be in that best of 3 stage. And so tomorrow, we're going to be getting the 2-0 games. Of course, the day after, we'll be getting the best of 1s, the last of the best of 1s in the 1-in-1 games. And then, of course, the day after that, we're going to get some more best of 3s with the 0-2 games to determine the first 2 teams eliminated from the tournament. You guys know how the format goes. You can see it up on the screen now. Of course, the matchups that are coming tomorrow, if you can win those, that means that you are going to be moving on to the quarterfinals, guaranteed. You will not have to play another Swiss stage game. Losing that means you will go to the 2-1 side. You guys, again, understand how this works. So I'm only going to be previewing the 2-0 matchups here. We'll preview all the 1-1 and 0-2 matchups later, but I will give a quick overview and say that this is a pretty good draw. In terms of storylines, we have a lot of matchups that we have seen before, but in intriguing ways. You know, a lot of the 1-1 matchups are all very familiar. In fact, all of them are very familiar for one reason or another, for one significant historical reason or another, so I'm excited to see all of those. The 0-2 matchups are certainly ideal for the major region teams. I think if they had drawn each other, one of them going out as one of the first 2 teams eliminated would have not been ideal, but I think both of them are now expecting to move on to the 1-2 stage. But for the 2-0 matchups, this is a dream matchup for Dplus KIA and for LNG, and certainly not for Hanwha Life, and probably not for Gen.G either. The 2 best teams right now at this tournament ended up drawing each other in Hanwha Life and Gen.G, and that's a hard series to predict, man. Gen.G was able to take basically every single series that these 2 teams played against each other all year long, except for the finals, when it really mattered the most. I'm going to stick to my guns and say that Gen.G is the favorite here. If HLE ended up picking up the win, I wouldn't be surprised, but right now, these are the 2 best teams in the world, or at least that's kind of what we're seeing at this tournament. I would not be surprised if this is a very back and forth best of 3, but for now, I'm going to stick to my guns and say that Gen.G is going to be able to come out on top. We'll see if I am correct or incorrect about that, but what a dream draw for Dplus KIA and LNG Esports. These are like really, really good matchups for both of them. DK is now sitting here and they're like, our path to getting to quarterfinals was the number 2 seed from Europe, the number 1 seed from North America, and now the number 3 seed from the LPL. I just have to win those series, and then I'm moving on to quarterfinals. Yes, sign me up for that. I think they're going to be pretty enthused about that. They've had a really, really easy path up until this point, but LNG is no longer a pushover. With them beating Bilibili Gaming, they have cemented that the version of them that we saw in the regular season, where they could beat anybody, is absolutely there, and for me, they're favorites coming into this series. They've also, I wouldn't say had an easy path. They had to play Bilibili Gaming, and that's certainly not an easy path, but they have earned their spot here. And so for me right now, in terms of form, LNG is definitely the favorite over DK. It's a dream draw for LNG because it's really one of the only matchups that I think they would be favorited in. I think they would not be favorites against HLE, and they certainly wouldn't be favorites against Gen.G either. And so for LNG, they're very happy about it. But my prediction, Gen.G and LNG moving on as the first 2 teams to qualify for the quarterfinals. Let me know if you agree or disagree down in the comment section below. And that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering every single day of Worlds all the way through the finals. We'll be covering every single game in the same way that we did here today on this channel, so hit subscribe for that. But we're also going to be doing a lot of off-season coverage. We're already seeing a lot of roster moves be announced in the West. Really excited to see where things move forward for some of these teams, so if you're interested in all of that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.